From our perspective, the real threats to the wild salmon do not come from the salmon farming industry, but rather from pollution and habitat destruction and, of course, overfishing. I think perhaps the pollution might be the most serious.
Just how serious became clear shortly afterwards when poachers using cyanide wiped out 15,000 of Dr. Scott's young salmon.
Excuse me, tell me what's happening here?
What's actually happening is that the sailage seep is coming into the river and it's taking the oxygen out of the river. And the trout can't get the oxygen, so they're dying. This happens every year. Farmers every year, no respect for nothing, and that's what's happening.
I was about 2 miles up the river to the end of the bush. It's another 2 or 3 miles. They're wiped out. Eels, everything. Tar, salmon, anything's there, it's dead.
There have been over 30 fish kills in the north this year compared to 25 in 1988. In the south, the figure has almost doubled, 90 so far as opposed to 50 last year. While the summer drought has undoubtedly contributed, the major cause, time and again, is agriculture. Silage, slurry, piggery effluent. And chemical waste from industry has had an increasing role in habitat destruction.
3 generations are all as good as dead.
Fines range from 100 to 500 pounds, bearing no relationship to the real cost. For the first time, though, this has been calculated by Gershom Kennedy of the Fisheries Research Laboratory in Coleraine.
In habitat like this, there is more than one age class of salmon and trout living, 2 or 3 age classes usually. And if they are killed, that is those 3 generations wiped out. So from our trapping information and our survival information from electric fishing, we have been able to calculate that the total adult loss, the crop loss from those juveniles, is in the order of £8, £8.50 per square metre.
That puts the cost of polluting a 1 kilometre stretch of prime stream at a staggering £85,000. Dr. Kennedy is convinced that what applies to the bush holds good for every river in Ireland. Important research work has now established the optimum densities for survival and growth in the breeding rivers. What is needed now is the will to protect and exploit our rivers and inshore waters to provide a more even spread from the annual salmon run. Here's another issue. The predators abound. At Sheep Island off the Antrim coast, for instance. In the 30s, 27 pairs of cormorants nested there. The bird was made a protected species, and today over 400 pairs breed there undisturbed. They're voracious feeders, and salmon is very much on the menu. Some biologists reckon cormorants consume half the seagoing smolts every year. That theory is difficult to prove, but there's no doubt that Sheep Island is within easy flying time of every salmon stream on the north coast.
You'd wonder what makes a salmon go for the fly in the first place, wouldn't you?
Yes, they tell me they don't feed when they go into freshwater. The scientists say that there's no food in their stomach when they open the fish up, and yet they will take a prawn.
Could I interrupt this conversation, gentlemen? I can understand that an angler would feel that he's being cheated by not getting as many fishes as he would like, but surely it's a petty squabble between you and the commercial netters.
Well, that's true to an extent, but the fact of the matter is that there's great benefit to be had from angling. We in the Ulster Angling Federation feel that harvesting salmon by rod angling is a much better way of harvesting the resource.
How do you work that out?
Well, if you work out, when a netsman nets a salmon, he gets whatever he gets per pound for the salmon, and that's it. When a fisherman hooks a salmon, he has come down the river, he's expended money on travel, on tackle, he goes to the pub, food, maybe has an overnight stay, that sort of thing. There's a lot more benefit from angling.
Jim Hockey knows that other countries, especially Iceland, have banned commercial netting at sea in favour of fish traps inshore and proper development of rod fisheries in the rivers. This has proved a real money spinner for rural communities and a major revenue earner for the country. But before pressing the argument further here, first he had to prove his thesis. That required a trip to Dublin. At the Economic and Social Research Institute, he put his case to Professor Brendan Whelan.
Have a seat, Jim.
Thanks. Right. Well, Professor Whelan, would we be right in thinking that if this large percentage taken by the nets was reduced and the amount of fish taken by anglers was increased, that there would be a reasonable economic benefit from that?
Well, we've recently done some studies on this subject, and in fact in the 70s we'd done some earlier work on this in the same area. And what we found is that a commercial fish might be worth something in the region of maybe 12 or 15 pounds. Correspondingly, the expenditure by an angler to catch a fish would probably be in the region of maybe 400 pounds. Mm-hmm. That's what a visiting angler would spend to catch a salmon. However, it isn't quite as simple as that. The critical management decision is in restricting the net catch, the commercial catch, in such a way as to give a certain number of extra fish to the rod fishery and what the consequences of that are. And even when all those factors are taken into account, you're talking about a differential of 100% in value between the value of a rod-caught fish and the value of a commercially caught salmon.
At 400 pounds of fish, the argument appears compelling. Canada has controlled its salmon fishery, so have Norway, Scotland and Iceland. They've spread the benefit more evenly in the controlled and productive exploitation of the fish. Ireland is out of step in addressing the issue of just who should fish the salmon. Change will not happen overnight, but come it must. The implications of overfishing and pollution, of falling catches and smaller stock must sound alarm bells. They cannot be ignored.
The underwater world around the Irish coast is home to a huge variety of marine animals. It is also the home of a fish we know very little about, the mysterious sea trout. What we do know about the sea trout is that it feeds in the sea and breeds in fresh water. And while it lives here in the ocean, it builds up valuable food stores. During spring and summer, the trout pushes upriver from the sea, seeking its native stream high in the hills. As the large sea trout move upstream in the spring, they meet the small juvenile trout or smolt on their first journey to the sea. The mighty spring salmon are also migrating upstream at this time. Despite the best efforts of our scientists, the sea trout has retained its life secrets. We still cannot tell a juvenile brown trout from a young sea trout. Sea trout are strong, hard fish which pound for pound can outjump any salmon. On their way upstream, the fish are hunted by poachers of various sizes and shapes. But given a choice, this otter would much prefer a meal of eels. For the sea trout shoals, it's a journey of obstacles. There are rapids, cascades and successive falls as the trout head for their spawning streams in the high hills. About 10,000 years ago, the first sea trout arrived in our freshwater rivers and lakes. That would have been just after the Ice Age. But the riddle of why some of these trout will migrate today to feed in the sea, while others are resident here in freshwater, still remains a mystery. Hard, hungry waters of this barren granite landscape, the young sea trout eke out a simple existence. They are plentiful in most short rivers running directly into the Atlantic and also in coastal lakes. These areas of gravel-laden streams hold large stocks of trout. But which are the brown trout and which are the sea trout? For some unknown reason, 70% or more of adult sea trout are female, while the males remain in freshwater as resident brown trout. What instinct drives the sea trout back up into the hills? Is this fry a brown trout or a sea trout? In November, the mended kelts, which are the fish that have spawned, rest and then move towards the sea in March or April. While the fish are moving downstream, these scientists are at work attempting to understand some of the mysteries. The scales of a sea trout holds the key to its life history, for like the rings on a tree, periods of fast and poor growth are obvious to the trained eye.
Sea trout. 31.4.
In the past, it was thought that scale reading was a simple task. If there was erosion on the fish's scale, this was taken as proof that the sea trout had spawned. No erosion, no spawning. But recent work on the River Erith in County Mayo has changed the thinking on this, as fish biologist Ken Whelan explains.
Now this one here, this is one of the ones we were talking about without any spawning mark, and it just went out to sea as a 2-year-old smolt and came back in again to us after being in fresh water, because it had some residual eggs inside it, but there was no spawning mark as such on it. From the scale, it's obvious that the fish had spent 2 years in fresh water and 1.5 years feeding in the sea, but there's no spawning mark, despite the fact that there were some leftover or residual eggs in the fish's body cavity from the previous winter.
We've never found a residual egg syndrome, as you might call it, but we certainly have a number of fish that we know have been in fresh water and are coming out, and they have no perceptible spawning mark. And we're beginning to wonder whether that's because, as we know now, a number of these fish are feeding in fresh water. And the criteria now are that to get a spawning mark you must have erosion, and to get erosion there must be a lack of feeding, lack of growth. So if they're feeding, they're still growing, or they're maintaining the growth, and you get no spawning mark.
There's the other phenomenon that you get around here as well, where some sea trout are coming in very late into October, heavily laden with eggs. And if those fish happen to be fish that move back out again in the December period, that might also account for the fact that you wouldn't have a great deal of erosion on the scale, but they could have deposited the eggs and gone back out.
Unlike salmon, which rarely spawn more than twice in their life cycle, sea trout may spawn 7 or 8 times. By marking adult fish with indelible dye, scientists can trace their seasonal movements. They can calculate how many fish die naturally, how many are caught by fishermen, and they can assess the trout's ability to return to their native river. A blue dye mark on the anal fin is a telltale sign. It indicates that the fish passed this way last spring. A second dye mark is now placed on a different fin. Hopefully this sea trout will appear again next year. After spending 2 or more years in freshwater, the 9-inch sea trout smolt makes its way to the estuary. It feeds actively and quickly. It soon becomes accustomed to its new environment, where it must learn to be even more aware of predators. The shoals of young sea trout feed close to the shore along the whole of the Irish coastline, from the rocky shores of Mayo on the west coast to the pebble beaches and sandy estuaries of the east coast. There is a difference, however, in the growth rate of the east coast trout and that of the west coast. The east coast fish grow much faster because the feeding is richer. Unlike the salmon, the sea trout do not wander far from the shore, and they often enter estuaries seeking food. They are active predators and feed on sprat, sand eels, small fish, shrimp and other crustacea. In summer, they can often be found with the gulls and the mackerel shoals chasing sprat and killing fry. Sea trout enter rivers from June to October, but most of them migrate upstream during July and August. That looks like a nice stretch of water. A nice long run with plenty of cover for the fish. Sea trout flourish in rivers like this where growth is poor and survival in freshwater is difficult. The larger fish can arrive as early as April, but generally speaking, June to October is the real sea trout season. It is the wind and the rain that urges the sea trout to run. The fast-flowing floodwaters rush through the estuary and bring brown, fresh water into the open sea. The faint river odour attracts the sea trout, enticing them to make their way upstream. With the sea trout must face many dangerous obstacles before reaching the spawning beds. As well as avoiding sporting anglers and birds, the trout must also dodge drift nets and illegal stake nets, which are often within the estuaries themselves.
Mark, at the other point, will you open her up a small bit and we'll check it out?
With the diminishing salmon numbers, fishermen are now even more dependent than ever on netting sea trout. As the flood drops, the larger fish are confined to pools, and at night they move further upstream, often with their backs out of the water. Night fishing for sea trout is popular during the summer months. Most anglers believe that the best sport is to be had from dusk until about 2 o'clock in the morning. Fresh-run sea trout fight very well, and often, when they are hooked, jump 7 or 8 times in quick succession. Anglers new to this kind of fishing are often disappointed when they discover that what they were fighting in the dark is not really the big fish they imagined it was. The shoals of fish move quickly, using every possible flood until they reach the relative safety of their native lake. They settle below the streams where they themselves were born, often mimicking the feeding patterns of the resident brown trout. Insects, such as beetles, grasshoppers and daddy longlegs, figure prominently on their menu. In the past, anglers were encouraged to keep all the small trout they caught. It was thought that these small fish would eat a large proportion of the available food and would devour the ova of salmon and sea trout at spawning time. We know now that this advice was misguided, as even trout as small as 25 or 30 centimetres may descend to the sea. All small trout in these waters should be treated as sea trout and returned carefully to the water. As autumn approaches, the young trout leave the spawning streams and drop back into the lake. It is late October or November before the adult sea trout move into the spawning streams. Competition for space and for a mate is fierce. Spawning usually takes place around dusk. A narrow depression in the gravel, which is known as a red. Meanwhile, the male stays close by. Some of these eggs will become sea trout and some will become brown trout. After spawning, the fish travel back to the lake to recover. In March or April, the trout turn silver again and they begin their journey seawards. The fish may remain in the sea for only 2 or 3 months before returning once again on their spawning migration back to freshwater.